everyone, I hope you're all doing well. In today's video, I'm going to read some more stories from the Anthony Horowitz horror book. I had a request on the last one from Soph Gilbert to do The Lift, The Man with the Yellow Face, Twist Cottage or Flight 715 next. So I'm going to do, I think, The Lift first, yeah. And then if it's a short one, I'll do one of the others as well, so 310. The Lift. Let's go over this again, the Detective Chief Inspector said. Charles Falcon was a small, unhappy-looking man with greying hair and tired blue eyes. He was wearing a dark suit with a striped tie hanging halfway down his chest. His clothes were, like him, crumpled. He had been a policeman for 30 years, and as far as he was concerned, that was about 20 years too long. He had lost count of the number of murders he had investigated. The stabbings and shootings, the batterings and stranglings, and that was in addition to the armed robberies, burglaries, kidnappings and assaults. He was glad it was almost over. 2 more months, then retirement back to Norfolk. A little house in Hunstanton, a dog, long walks along the beach, and no more death. 2 more months, and then this had to come along. He was sitting at his desk in New Scotland Yard. There was a second man opposite him, 30 years his junior, neat and enthusiastic. His name was Jack Beagle, and he was a detective superintendent. He had his notebook open in front of him. "Where do you want to start?" Beagle asked. "From the top," Falcon said. "Let's start with the family." Beagle flipped through the pages in his book. "All right," he said. "Arthur and Mary Smith live in Stenning. It's a small village near the South Downs. They own the fruit shop there. They have one son, Eric, aged 11. As a Christmas present, they decided to bring him to London. Christmas shopping, lunch at a pizza restaurant, then the afternoon performance of the Phantom of the Opera. They had seats in the circle, A23 to..." "All right, get on with it," Falcon interrupted. That was the trouble with Beagle, too many details. Give him half a chance and he'd be describing what sort of ice creams they'd had in the interval. Beagle flicked a page. After the show, they went to Covent Garden. There's a place in the new piazza that sells gadgets. Eric wanted a South Park clock, insisted on it. So although they were tired, they went. They got to the station at 5:15. That was when he vanished. "Eric Smith," Falcon muttered. He closed his eyes and sighed. Covent Garden is one of London's oldest and deepest tube stations. There are only 2 platforms. The Piccadilly line runs east and west. There are also no escalators. 4 lifts connect the top and the bottom. There's a steep twisting staircase, but not many people use it as it has 199 steps. "It was very busy," Beagle went on. "After all, it was only 3 weeks to Christmas, and the station was full of people shopping and all the rest of it. There was quite a crowd waiting for the lift, and that was when it happened. This boy, Eric, I'm afraid he doesn't sound a very nice piece of work, a bit spoiled and disobedient." "You're not saying his parents did him in?" Falcon cut in gloomily. He'd investigated just such a case about 10 years before. "Oh no, sir. He's their only son and they dote on him. That's why I mentioned the seats. They were the most expensive in the theatre." "Go on." "They were waiting for the lifts and there were people all around them, hundreds of people. The Smiths were at the back of the line, and then what happened was 2 lifts arrived at exactly the same time, one next to the other. The queue moved forward and Arthur, Mary and young Eric just managed to squeeze into the lift on the left. But then for some reason, Eric decided he'd get into the lift on the right. He dodged out of one and into the other. His parents called out to him, but it was already too late. The lift doors closed, but at the same time, and that was that. So he was in one lift and they were in the other. Yes, sir, they weren't very happy about it. They told Eric to stay close to them, but like I say, he doesn't sound like the sort of boy who does what he's told. Even so, they weren't particularly worried. After all, it only takes about a minute to get to the top, and both lifts would arrive at exactly the same time, which they did. Yes, sir, they arrived at the top and the doors opened at exactly the same second. The crowd poured out, and here's the rub. There was no sign of Eric. The boy had disappeared. They were certain he got into the lift. We have a witness, a Mrs. Nerricott, who saw him run out of one lift and into the other. Did Mrs. Nerricott get into the lift with him? No, sir, there wasn't room, but she definitely saw the door close with the boy inside. All right, Falcon reached into his pocket and took out a chocolate Rolo. It was his last one. He ate it himself. So Eric was in one lift and his parents were in another. Could he have slipped out ahead of them at the top? packages. There were Arthur and Mary Smith, both of them weighed down with a load of bags and packages. Arthur was short and bald, in his late 40s. Mary was a slightly mousy woman with permed hair, wearing a thick coat. Eric was standing next to them. He wasn't holding anything. He was plump with jug ears and freckles. His hair was spiky, and Falcon knew from colour photographs sent to his office, ginger. He was wearing combat trousers and a fleece with a scarf around his neck, but no jacket. The film showed exactly what happened. That was the hell of it. The whole thing had been recorded. At 4:44:05, the two lifts arrived simultaneously at the bottom. The crowd surged forward. Falcon saw Arthur and Mary Smith get into the lift on the left with their son. And there on the screen was Eric, suddenly running into the lift on the right, squeezing in behind the crowd. He saw Arthur turn and realised what the boy had done. He saw Arthur call out, although of course there was no sound. Both lift doors were already closing. It was all exactly as Beagle had described. Cut now to the top floor. There was no camera inside the lifts. The time on the tape was 16:45:03. 58 seconds had passed. Both lift doors opened. The lifts at Covent Garden actually have two sets of doors, one at the front and one at the back. You enter the lift from one side, but you exit through the other. Arthur and Mary were the last to come out. There were people everywhere, bustling forward through the automatic ticket barriers. The camera mounted over the exit picked up every one of them, and Falcon leant forward, examining the faces carefully. There were old people and young people, smart people and scruffy ones. A big man with a beard and a wart on his nose fed his ticket into the machine. A teenager carrying a football followed right behind him. Then there was a woman chewing gum, another woman walking with her arms crossed. There was a man blowing his nose into a handkerchief, a second man already lighting a cigar. A Chinese woman with a swollen cheek and an old lady bent over doubles, supporting herself on a thick walking stick. A constant stream of humanity flowing out of the lift and away from the station. But there was no sign of Eric. It was an impossible magic trick. Arthur and Mary were there, on the screen, searching everywhere, beginning to panic. A few minutes later, they would call the police, but it was already too late. The boy had gone. Falcon flicked a button and the picture froze. "So what do you think?" he asked. "I don't know, sir." Falcon had never heard his junior officer sound so defeated. "I just can't work it out at all. I mean, we can actually see it. That's what beats me. It happened exactly how Mr. and Mrs. Smith described it." "Where are the parents?" "They're waiting downstairs." Arthur and Mary were sitting in a room that smelled of new paint and old disinfectant. Her eyes were red from crying. Her husband had one hand resting on her arm, trying to comfort her, but he looked as lost as she did. "We don't often come up to London," he said, but Eric insisted. He wanted to go to Hamleys and see this musical. "We should have run after him," Mary stammered. Fresh tears brimmed at her eyes, but it was very difficult. "We had all his presents," Arthur explained. Eric had chosen a new train set and the walkie-talkies, the keyboard, the rollerblades, and the modelling kit. "We had so many bags we could hardly move." "My little angel," Mary wailed. "He wasn't a complete angel," Arthur said gently. "I mean, we told him to stay close to us, but he wouldn't listen, and the truth is he'd been in a bad mood all day. He was very upset when we wouldn't buy him that remote control helicopter. But it was £200. He was also sick after that third ice cream at the theatre. Maybe that was why he decided to run out of the lift like that." Arthur Smith shook his head. "We did tell him to stay close." "Just find him for us," Mary said. She took out a handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes. "He's got to be somewhere." Late that night, the two detectives returned to Covent Garden tube station. The tube had already closed down, but the station was busy. There were police officers everywhere, searching through the ticket office and moving slowly, step by step, up and down the stairs. There were more policemen below, some with dogs sniffing along the platforms and even following the tracks into the tunnel itself. Both the lifts were being examined by forensic scientists in white coats and plastic gloves. The ticket machine had been opened and all the tickets, thousands of them, retrieved. There was just a chance that the police might find a fingerprint on one of them. Maybe it would lead them to a maniac, a murderer, but even that wouldn't explain how the 11-year-old boy with at least 30 complete strangers packed in tight all around him had managed to evaporate into thin air. Falcon peered into the lift that carried Eric up. It was an ugly metal box with a heavy sliding door at each end. There was a small window in the side, but the glass was too dirty to see through, and anyway it was impossible to climb out. There was something almost Victorian about it all. The whole station was grimy and old-fashioned. The passageways, lined with off-white tiles, curved into the distance. The floor was black concrete, with no trains coming and no this stage, sir, but I think it's likely. And that's all. One button off a shirt, could be his, could be anyone's. We're going to try and match it up. Thank you. Falcon took the lift back up to the surface. He felt almost suffocated, standing inside the metal box. There was a lurch as the lift began to rise, and then nothing but the creak of the ancient cables pulling him slowly up. What had happened to Eric Smith when he had taken the lift at 5:15 that afternoon? He couldn't have climbed onto the roof or anything like that. He couldn't have left it at all until the doors opened, but he definitely got in and he definitely hadn't got out. It was enough to drive a detective crazy. There was a team of policemen on the top floor, examining a great pile of tickets taking out of the machines. One of them looked up as Falcon emerged from the lift. What was his name? Williams or Willard or something? What have you got? Falcon demanded. Nothing very much, sir, except one thing. Go on. When the used tickets are sucked into the machine, they fall into a compartment, sir. They're emptied regularly throughout the day, but nobody touched the machines after the boy disappeared, so at least we've been able to work out more or less where people were coming from at around about 5:15 this afternoon. And, well, it's quite strange really. There are about 40 tickets from the same station. Burnt Oak. It struck me as odd. Why? Well, sir, Burnt Oak isn't a very important station, tucked away almost at the end of the Northern Line, and it just seems strange that so many people should have made the same journey, Burnt Oak to Covent Garden, at exactly the same time. All right, Williams, Falcon said. Have the tickets sent to my office. Yes, sir, the policeman scowled. My name's Willard, sir. Later that night, Falcon lay in bed in the small flat he rented in a back street of Victoria. He was only half asleep. He was trying to dream about Norfolk. He could just picture himself out on the beach, watching the sunset with his dog. What sort of dog would he buy? An Alsatian, perhaps? No, that would remind him too much of the police. But try as he might, he couldn't dream what he wanted to dream. The scene kept changing. There was Eric Smith standing on the sand in his combat trousers, surrounded by people carrying parcels and shopping bags. Something rose out of the sea. It was the lift. The door slid open and Eric walked into it, but now the lift had changed. It became some sort of metallic monster, and the doors had been replaced by jagged teeth that sliced down. Eric screamed, the waves rolled in, and Falcon woke up with a start, surprised and relieved to see that it was 7 o'clock, the start of another day. Beagle was waiting for him at the office. We'd had a breakthrough, he said. Oh yes, Falcon had brought himself a bacon roll on the way in. It was still in the bag, beginning to get cold. One of the men on the screen, Beagle said. He was pleased with himself, and Falcon guessed that he had probably been working all night. One of the men in the lift with the boy. I thought I knew him from somewhere, and I was right. He took out a photograph and slid it on the desk in front of Falcon. A big man with a beard and a wart on his nose. Falcon remembered him from the security pictures. Who is he? He asked. He's a professor at the University of London, also a writer. His name is Abraham Orlov. Doesn't sound English. I believe he was born in the Ukraine. Falcon studied the photograph. You said you knew him, he muttered. Has he got a criminal record? No, sir, but I was at London University, and although I never met him personally, he's stuck in my mind. Do you remember that plane crash about 8 years ago? Falcon shook his head. A small plane went down in the Arctic Circle. There were 70 people on board, mainly academics, geologists, that sort of thing. They'd been studying the ozone layer up in Greenland. It was assumed that they were all killed, but in fact more than half of them survived, stuck in the ice for almost 5 months. Yes, Falcon did remember something now. The story had made every newspaper at the time. There was something about it that made him feel uneasy. What was it? Orlov was one of them, Beagle went on. He wrote a book about it afterwards. The Will to Survive. That was the title. I never read it myself. Anyway, at least it means we found one person who was in the lift with Eric Smith. I thought you might want to speak to him. Do you have an address? Half an hour later, Falcon and Beagle were sitting in a small room in Gower Street, close to the Tottenham Court Road tube station. The room was so cluttered with books it was almost impossible to move. There were books on shelves, on every seat, and in great stacks on the carpet. A pair of tattered curtains hung over a window that looked out onto a bare brick wall. Very little light found its way into the room. Abraham Orlov was a big man, bigger even than the camera had made him appear. He was wearing a red waistcoat stretched over a great barrel of a chest, and his shoulders were so broad that his head seemed almost lost, balanced on a sprawling cushion of a beard that totally concealed his neck. His hands and wrists were also hairy, and he had thick, bushy eyebrows. He wore thin gold spectacles and smoked a pipe that had filled the room with a cloud of blue-grey smoke. Yes, indeed, Detective Chief Inspector, he was saying. He had a loud, hollow voice and an Eastern European accent. I was most certainly in London last night. May I ask what you were doing? Falcon said. My dear sir, you may ask what you like. I have nothing to hide. He smiled and Falcon felt a shiver of disgust. The man had repulsive teeth. They were yellow and uneven and somehow looked too sharp for a human being. He had seen more attractive teeth than that in a dog. Last night was an important anniversary. I met some very dear friends at our club, and then we travelled into town together to see a concert. It was your birthday, sir. No, you haven't read my book, Detective Chief Inspector. The eyes twinkled behind the glasses. It was exactly 8 years since our rescue from the Arctic ice cap. Everyone thought we were dead, but then they found we were living. You can imagine, my dear sir, that we survivors become very close, trapped in the wreckage of our plane for so many months. When we returned to civilization, we decided to form a club. We purchased our own small clubhouse tucked away in the north of this delightful city. Nothing elaborate, it's just somewhere private where we can talk in comfort, and we often meet there socially. This clubhouse wouldn't happen to be in Burnt Oak, would it, sir? Beagle asked. As a matter of fact, it is, just off the Edgware Road. We all met there at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and then travelled into town together. How many of you were there? There are 51 members in the club, including myself. Not everyone could make it last night, but 35 of us set out together. On the Northern Line from Burnt Oak Station. He nodded at Beagle. Change at King's Cross. 51 members, Falcon said. You remember what Beagle had told him that morning? But I understood there were 70 people on the plane. Alas, 19 of them failed to survive, Orlov said. He twisted his face into an expression of pain. You must know the story, Detective Chief Inspector. I made no secret of it. In fact, I wrote a book about it. 19 people were killed in the crash. The rest of us were trapped. We had water, we could use melted ice, but we had no food. I'm afraid that the will to survive forced us to make a painful decision. Yes, sir, Falcon said, but he already knew what was coming. Now he remembered the newspaper reports from 8 years before. We were forced to cannibalize the corpses. For 5 months, we ate nothing but human flesh. For a brief moment, Orlov's tongue appeared, protruding out of his lips above his beard. Then it was sucked back into his mouth. It was painful and of course disgusting to cut strips of flesh and lay them out in the wreckage of the aircraft's wings to dry in the sun. To be forced, day after day, to swallow our unfortunate companions. I don't need to describe it to you. If you want to know more, you should read my book. But it was a simple choice. We could eat or we could die. We chose to live. If I may get back to what happened yesterday, Falcon said. Suddenly wanted to get out of this office, away from the smoke, out into the winter sunlight. I wonder if you noticed an 11-year-old boy get into the lift with you at Covent Garden Station. I did indeed, Detective Chief Inspector. A rather fat little boy with ginger hair, wearing baggy trousers and a scarf. That was him. He pushed his way in just before the lift doors closed. Then he forced his way to the front of the lift. He was the first to leave. I was a little worried about him as he seemed too young to be out on his own, but before I could do anything, he was out of my sight. I saw him go through the ticket machine and into the street, but then he was gone. You saw him exit onto the street, Beagle asked. Absolutely. But forgive me, sir, Beagle was confused. The security cameras at the station show you leaving the lift, but there was no sign of the boy. Orlov frowned and sucked his pipe. Smoke trickled over his lips and into his beard. Could it be perhaps that the camera was malfunctioning? He said at last, because I assure you, I saw him leave with my own eyes. It is possible, Falcon agreed. He stood up. Thank you very much, Mr. Orlov. I'm sorry to have taken up your time. Anything I can do to help? Orlov waved a pudgy hand like a king dismissing a courtier. Falcon paused at the door. One last question, sir. Did you go to the concert, you and your friends? Indeed so. Mozart and Brahms at St. Christopher's Church in Covent Garden. It was a delightful evening. And I suppose you went on to dinner afterwards. Orlov hesitated, the pipe halfway to his lips. No, as a matter of fact we didn't. We weren't hungry. The two policemen left. Falcon said nothing until they got back to New Scotland Yard. Sitting next to him in the car, Beagle had become more and more frustrated, and when they reached the office he finally broke out. He was lying. That boy never left the lift, and the camera's fine. It's already been checked. I know, Jack, Falcon said. realised he had found himself alone with them for 58 seconds. Orlov had been lying, of course. He had said that his experience in the Arctic Circle had been painful and disgusting, but Falcon had seen the truth. He had seen it in the flash in those eyes behind the gold-framed spectacles, and that little tongue so pink and moist as it passed over his lips. Perhaps they'd hated it at first, the survivors in that plane, having to survive for 5 months eating human flesh. But suppose they had come to enjoy it. Suppose they had come to like the taste. They had 19 bodies, 38 roast shoulders, 38 roast legs, 190 stewed knuckles. Day after day they would have sat there, feasting. This is disgusting. But then, after they were rescued, how would they have coped? No more human flesh. Oh yes, they could meet in their little clubhouse and talk about it, relive all those happy meals, but they could only dream of the succulent pink meat, and all the time they would be hungry, so hungry, until a small, plump boy walked right into the middle of them, and a door closed, and they suddenly realised they couldn't resist it anymore, and as one they had fallen on him with teeth and nails. Falcon didn't like to think about it. At least it would have been over for Eric very quickly. He forced himself to look at the screen. There was Orlov walking out of the lift, Orlov and his friends. Was it really gum that the woman was chewing? Was the man with the handkerchief blowing his nose or wiping his mouth? That Chinese woman, was her cheeks swollen, or was it just that her mouth was full? The old woman with the walking stick. Looking more closely, Falcon could see that the handle was shaped very much like a child's foot, and as for the teenager with the football, he wondered now if it actually was a football at all. He turned off the machine. "Are you all right, sir?" Beagle asked. No. Falcon sat staring at the blank screen. 2 questions were going through his mind. How was he going to tell the parents what he knew? And no wonder Orlov had been so calm. How was he ever going to prove it? I feel like they would know whether it was a child's head or a football, right? Oh, didn't say anything about child's head, I made that up. But surely they would know if it was a football or a body part. And the same with the foot and the walking stick. And like someone would have seen something, surely. Anyway, that was disgusting. I think I'll read one more. So, I'll read The Man with the Yellow Face. The Man with the Yellow Face. I want to tell you how it happened, but it's not easy. It's all a long time ago now, and even though I think about it often, there are still things I don't understand. Maybe I never did. Why did I even go into the machine? What I'm talking about is one of those instant photograph booths. It was on platform 1 at York Station. 4 shots for £2.50. It's probably still there now if you want to go and look at it. I've never been back, so I can't be sure. Anyway, there I was with my uncle and aunt, waiting for the train to London, and we were 20 minutes early, and I had about £3 on me, which was all that was left of my pocket money. I could have gone back to the kiosk and bought a comic, another bar of chocolate, a puzzle book. I could have gone into the cafe and bought cokes all round. I could have just hung on to it. But maybe you know this feeling when you've been on holiday and your mum has given you a certain amount to spend. You've just got to spend it. It's almost a challenge. It doesn't matter what you spend it on, you've just got to be sure it's all gone by the time you get home. Why the photographs? I was 13 years old then, and I suppose I was what you'd call good looking. Girls said so anyway. Fair hair, blue eyes, not fat, not thin. It was important to me how I looked. The right jeans, the right trainers, that sort of thing. But it wasn't crucial to me. What I'm trying to say is, I didn't take the photographs to pin on the wall, or to prove to anyone what a movie star I was. I just took them, I don't know why. It was the end of a long weekend in York. I was with my uncle and aunt, because back in London, my mum and dad were quietly and efficiently arranging their divorce. It was something that had been coming for a long time, and I wasn't bothered by it anymore, but even so, they'd figured it would upset me to see the removal men come in. My father was moving out of the house and into a flat, and although my mother was keeping most of the furniture, there was still his piano, his books and pictures, his computer and the old wardrobe that he had inherited from his mother. Suddenly everything was his or hers, before it had simply been ours. Uncle Peter and Aunt Anne had been drafted in to keep me diverted while it all happened, and they'd chosen York, I suppose, because it was far away and I'd never been there before. But if it was a diversion, it didn't really work, because while I was in York Minster, or walking around the walls, or being trundled through the darkness in the Viking Museum, all I could think about was my father and how different everything would be without him, without the smell of his cigarettes and the sound of the out-of-tune piano echoing up the stairs. I was spoiled that weekend. Of course that's something parents do. The guiltier they feel, the more they'll spend, and a divorce, the complete upheaval of my life and theirs, was worth every penny. almost imagine that a steam train will pull in, a ghost train perhaps. York is both a medieval and a Victorian city, enough ghosts for everyone. But the photo booth was modern. It was an ugly metal box with its bright light glowing behind the plastic facings. It looked out of place on the platform, almost as if it had landed there from outer space. It was in a strange position too, quite a long way from the entrance and the benches where my uncle and aunt were sitting. You wouldn't have thought that many people would have come to this part of the platform. As I approached it, I was suddenly alone, and maybe I imagined it, but it seemed that a sudden wind had sprung up, as if blown my way by an approaching train. I felt the wind cold against my face, but there was no train. For a moment I stood outside the photo booth, wondering what I was going to do. One shot for the front of my exercise book, a shot for my father. He'd be seeing more of it now than he would of me. A silly cross-eyed shot for the fridge. Somewhere behind me, the tannoy system sprang to life. The train now approaching platform 2 is a 10:45 to Glasgow, calling at Darlington, Durham, Newcastle. The voice sounded far away, not even in the station. It was like a rumble coming out of the sky. I pulled back the curtain and went into the photo booth. There was a circular stool which you could adjust for height and a choice of backgrounds. A white curtain, a black curtain, or a blue wall. The people who designed these things were certainly imaginative. I sit down and looked at myself in the square of black glass in front of me. This was where the camera was, but looking in the glass I could only vaguely see my face. I could make out an outline, my hair falling down over one eye, my shoulders, the open neck of my shirt. But my reflection was shadowy, and like the voice on the tannoy, distant. It didn't look like me. It looked more like my ghost. Did I hesitate then, before I put the money in? I think I did. I didn't want these photographs. I was wasting my money. But at the same time, I was here now, and I might as well do it. I felt hemmed in, inside the photo booth, even though there was only one flimsy curtain separating me from the platform. Also, I was nervous that I was going to miss the train, even though there was still 15 minutes until it arrived. Suddenly, I wanted to get it over with. I put in the coins. For a moment, nothing happened, and I thought the photo booth might be broken. But then a red light glowed somewhere behind the glass, deep inside the machine. A devil eye winking at me. The light went out, and there was a flash, accompanied by a soft, popping sound that went right through my head. The first picture had caught me unaware. I was just sitting there with my mouth half open, before the machine flashed again, and I quickly adjusted the stool and twisted my features into the most stupid face I could make. The red eye blinked, followed by the flash. That one would be for the fridge. For the third picture, I whipped the black curtain across, leant back and smiled. The picture was for my father, and I wanted it to be good. The fourth picture was a complete disaster. I was pulling back the curtain, adjusting the stool, and trying to think of something to do when the flash went off, and I'd realised I'd taken a picture of my left shoulder with my face, annoyed and surprised, peering over the top. That was it. Those were the 4 pictures I took. I went outside the photo booth and stood there on my own, waiting for the pictures to develop. 3 minutes, according to the advert on the side. Nobody came anywhere near, and once again I wondered why they had put the machine so far from the station entrance. Further up the platform, the station clock ticked to 10:47. The minute hand was so big that I could actually see it moving, sliding over the Roman numerals. Doors slammed on the other side of the train. There was the blast of a whistle. The 10:45 to Glasgow shuddered out of the station, a couple of minutes late. The 3 minutes took an age to pass. Time always slows down when you're waiting for something. I watched the minute hand of the clock make 2 more complete circles. Another train without any carriages chugged backwards along a line on the far side of the station, and meanwhile the photo booth did nothing. Maybe there were wheels turning inside, chemicals splashing, spools of paper unfolding, but from where I was standing it just looked dead. Then, with no warning at all, there was a whir and a strip of white paper was spat out of a slot in the side. My photographs. I waited until a fan had blown the paper dry, then prized it out of its metal cage. Being careful not to get my fingers on the pictures themselves, I turned them over in my hand. 4 pictures. The first, me looking stupid. The second, me out of focus. The fourth, me from behind. But the third picture, in the middle of the strip, wasn't a picture of me at all. It was a picture of a man, and one of the ugliest men I had ever seen. Just looking at him, holding him in my hand, sent a shiver all the way up my arm and round the back of my neck. The man had a yellow face. There was something terribly wrong with his skin, which seemed to be crumpled up around his neck and chin, like an old paper bag. He had blue eyes, but they had sunk back, hiding in the dark shadows of his eye sockets. His hair was grey and string-like, hanging lifelessly over his forehead. The skin here was damaged too, as if someone had drawn a fingers, bending them over his face, trying to blot him out. But it was too late. Even when I wasn't looking at him, I could still see him. I could still feel him looking at me. But who was he, and how had he got there? I walked away from the machine, glad to be going back to where there were people, away from that deserted end of the platform. Obviously, the photo booth had been broken. It must have muddled up my photographs with those of whoever had visited it just before me. At least that's what I tried to tell myself. My Uncle Peter was waiting for me at the bench. He seemed relieved to see me. I thought we were going to miss the train, he said. He ground out the gouas he'd been smoking. He was as bad as my father when it came to cigarettes. High tar French, not just damaging your health, destroying it. So let's see them, Aunt Anne said. She was a pretty, rather nervous woman who always managed to sound enthusiastic about everything. How did they come out? The machine was broken, I said. The camera probably cracked when it saw your face. Peter gave one of his throaty laughs. Let's see. I held out the strip of film. They took it. Who's this? Anne tried to sound cheerful, but I could see that the man with the yellow face had disturbed her. I wasn't surprised. He disturbed me. He wasn't there, I said. I mean, I didn't see him. All the photographs were of me, but then they were developed. He was there. It must have been broken, Peter said. This must be the last person who was in there. Which is exactly what I had thought, only now I wasn't so sure, because it occurred to me that if there was something wrong with the machine, and everyone was getting photographs of someone else, then surely the man with the yellow face would have appeared at the very top of the row. One photograph of him followed by 3 of me. Then whoever went in next would get one picture of me, followed by the 3 of them, and so on. And there was something else. Now that I thought about it, the man was sitting in exactly the same position that I'd taken inside the photo booth. I'd pulled the black curtain across for the 3rd photograph, and there it was now. I'd been leaning back, and so was he. It was almost as if the man had somehow got into the machine and sat in a deliberate parody of me. And maybe there was something in that smile of his that was mocking and ugly. It was as if he was trying to tell me something, but I didn't want to know. I think he's a ghost, I said. A ghost, Peter laughed again. He had an annoying laugh. It was loud and jagged, like machine gun fire. A ghost in a platform photo booth. Peter. Anne was disapproving. She was worried about me. She'd been worried about me since the start of the divorce. I feel I know him, I said. I can't explain it, but I've seen him somewhere before. Where? Anne asked. I don't know. In a nightmare, Peter suggested. His face does look a bit of a nightmare. I looked at the picture again, even though I didn't want to. It was true, he did look familiar, but at the same time I knew that despite what I'd just said, it was a face I'd never seen before. The train now arriving at platform 1. It was the train announcer's voice again, and sure enough there was our train, looking huge and somehow menacing as it slid round the curve of the track. And it was at that very moment, as I reached out to take the photographs, that I had the idea that I shouldn't get on the train, because the man with the yellow face was going to be on it, that somehow he was dangerous to me, and that the machine had sent me his picture to warn me. My uncle and aunt gathered up our weekend bags. Why don't we wait, I said. What? My uncle was already halfway through the door. Can't we stay a little longer in York? We could take the train this afternoon. We've got to get back, my aunt said. As always, hers was the voice of reason. Your mother's going to be waiting for us at the station, and anyway, we've got reserved seats. Come on, Uncle Peter was caught between the platform and the train, and with people milling around us trying to get in, this obviously wasn't the best time or place for an argument. Even now, I wonder why I allowed myself to be pushed or persuaded into the train. I could have turned around and run away. I could have sat on the platform and refused to move. Maybe if it had been my mother and father there, I would have done. But then, of course, if my mother and father had only managed to stay together in the first place, none of it would have happened. Do I blame them? Yes, sometimes I do. I found myself on the train before I knew it. We had seats quite near the front, and that also played a part in what happened. While Uncle Peter stowed the cases up on the rack and Aunt Anne fished in her shopping bag for magazines, drinks and sandwiches, I took the seat next to the window, miserable and afraid without knowing why. The man with the yellow face, who was he? A psychopath perhaps, released from a mental hospital, travelling to London with a knife in his raincoat pocket, or a terrorist with a bomb, one of those suicide bombers you read about in the Middle East. Okay, I feel like that was unnecessary. Or a child killer, or some sort of monster. I was so certain I was going to meet him that I barely even noticed as the train jerked forward and began to move out of the station. The photographs were still clasped in my hand, and I kept on looking from the yellow face to the other passengers in the carriage, expecting at any moment to see him coming towards me. What's the matter with you? My uncle asked. You look like you've seen a ghost. I was expecting to. I said nothing. wrong until it had happened. We were travelling fast, whizzing through the green fields and clumps of woodland when I felt a slight lurch, as if invisible arms had reached down and pulled me out of my seat. That was all there was at first, a sort of mechanical hiccup. But then I had the strange sensation that the train was flying. It was like a plane at the end of the runway, the front of the train separating from the ground. It could only have lasted a couple of seconds, but in my memory those seconds seemed to stretch out forever. I remember my uncle's head turning, the question forming itself on his face, and my aunt perhaps realising what was happening before we did, opening her mouth to scream. I remember the other passengers. I carry snapshots of them in my head. A mother with 2 small daughters, both with ribbons in their hair. A man with a moustache, his pen hovering over the Times crossword. A boy of about my own age, listening to a Walkman. The train was almost full. There was hardly an empty seat in sight. And then the smash of the impact, the world spinning upside down, windows shattering, coats and suitcases tumbling down, sheets of paper whipping into my face, thousands of tiny fragments of glass swarming into me, the deafening scream of tearing metal, the sparks and the smoke and the flames leaping up, cold air rushing in, and then the horrible rolling and shuddering. It was like the very worst sort of fairground ride, only this time the terror wasn't going to stop. This time it was all for real. Silence. They always say there's silence after an accident, and they're right. I was on my back with something pressing down on me. I could only see out of one eye. Something dripped onto my face. Blood. Then the screams began. It turned out that some kids, maniacs, had dropped a concrete pile off a bridge outside Grantham. The train hit it and derailed. 9 people were killed in the crash, and a further 29 were seriously injured. I was one of the worst of them. I don't remember anything more of what happened, which is just as well, as my carriage caught fire and I was badly burned before my uncle managed to drag me to safety. He was hardly hurt in the accident, apart from a few cuts and bruises. Aunt Anne broke her arm. I spent many weeks in hospital and I don't remember much of that either. All in all, it was 6 months before I was better, but better in my case was never what I had been before. This all happened 30 years ago, and now I suppose I can't complain. After all, I wasn't killed, and despite my injuries, I enjoy my life. But the injuries are still there. The plastic surgeons did what they could, but I'd suffered 3rd-degree burns over much of my body, and there wasn't a whole lot they could do. My hair grew back, but it's always been grey and rather lifeless. My eyes are sunken, and then there's my skin. I sit there looking in the mirror, and the man with the yellow face looks back. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I hope you enjoyed these stories, and I'll see you in the next video. Good night.